program that kind of came to my mind in terms of talk about is the Arizona Wildcats. And there's just been so much turbulence for this program for a number of different reasons. I mean, you can go back to this time last year in 2023 when it was announced they had a $250 million financial deficit in terms of the actual school. It seems like there was some sort of miscalculation in terms of their budget. And then you look at this football team and you said to yourself, man, the impression this year was that they were going to contend for a Big 12 title this year. You have Noah Fifita, who was a rock star last year in 2023. You have wide receiver McMillan, who just declared for the NFL draft, and he was supposed to be a baller too. You brought in Dino Babers, who was the head coach at Syracuse for about 7 seasons, who is a brilliant offensive mind. And it just seems like nothing really clicked for this team this year. I mean, when you look at this team and you say to yourself, you bring in a guy like Brent Brennan, who has extensive history at San Jose State. However, when you look at his resume, his best season was his last year at San Jose State when they went 7-6. So in terms of that, you can definitely argue that's a little bit questionable in the sense of, yes, he is a highly experienced coach, but you got to say to yourself too that part of this deficit could be the reason why they went cheap and brought in someone like Brent Brennan, who will ride the wave and really go through this rebuild, because at this point they have a serious exodus going on. It's 30 plus athletes who have either transferred, medically retired, or have gone to the draft combined. So you just see this big transition going through, and the big question is, how do you really get through it from here? Because I would argue that Arizona Wildcats are in a full-blown rebuild right now. They replaced Dino Babers, who lost his play calling duties after the Kansas State game, to Seth Doedge, who was the offensive coordinator at Marshall last year, 20th ranked rushing attack in the entire country. And I guess what fascinates me about this move is the sense of, when you think of Seth Doedge, you think of his time at Texas Tech as his quarterback under Mike Leach, and then you say to yourself, well, he spent some time at USC. He was under Graham Harrell at Purdue for a little bit. And I think what intrigues me the most about this move is, to what extent will Seth Doedge go with the air raid principles that him and his coaching tree and the people that he served under, how far will they go into that versus how much will he actually try to run the ball? Because the one thing that's interesting about Noah Fifita is that he's got every athletic ability in the world. He's quick. He's got a cannon of an arm. So it's like, where do you find that balance between him being able to let it rip and have fun, but also to say to yourself, too, you can't just put every little thing on him too, because you got to imagine that's one of the reasons why Seth Doedge took this job too. And if you're Brent Brennan, you had to get in a guy like Seth Doedge, who can make an immediate impact and hopefully be one of the reasons why Fifita decides to stay, because at this point in time, it hasn't been announced whether or not he would transfer or not. Obviously, that would be the number one priority for him, as a number of players already left. And quite frankly, it's just hard to kind of put this together too, because I mean, you say to yourself, hey, you gave Brent Brennan a 5-year, $17 million deal. They were 21st in the AP poll going into this season. And when you have that many moves kind of all coming together, there's definitely some serious question marks. I mean, Brent Brennan fired his entire staff this year, so you're going to be going in with a whole new staff this year. You had a guy like Dino Babers coming in who should have been the guy that could have been calling plays and helped with recruiting a little bit. That clearly isn't really coming together too. But I think the one thing about Arizona Wildcat football that people aren't talking about is just how extensive a rebuild this is. Other than obviously all the things I kind of just layered out, but just to put in some perspective here, they went 4-8 last season. They lost by double digits to Arizona State, TCU, UCF, Colorado, BYU, and Kansas State. So the majority of their losses last year were by double digits. So obviously this isn't just a Dino Babers is no longer in tune with college football type of situation. To me, this just seems like just an overall just falling apart of this program, especially just how much expectations were in Tucson this year, and for essentially none of this to come together is quite frankly a little baffling to me. I mean, even you look at Fifita's stats here, he Last year, he had 25 touchdowns and 6 interceptions in 2023, about 2,800 passing yards compared to this year, 18 touchdowns and 12 interceptions with 2,900 passing yards. So I don't even sit there and say you call this a sophomore slump. I mean, I don't think he got as much help as you would like to, and I also would argue too that Dino Babers' offense wasn't really a good fit for what Fifita's legitimate skill set is, where I think what Seth Doedge is going to try to do is make it a little bit more complementary towards Fifita's skill set, and also make it in a way where you're not necessarily relying on Fifita to make 30, 40, 50 passing attempts every game, because that's the one glaring weakness. As I've been watching some Arizona football throughout this year, that was one of the things that kind of that struck me, especially watching them versus BYU, for example, where BYU was a lot more of a sort of a complementary style. Arizona really tried to kind of double down on this sort of air raid attack, but also you just clearly saw too that when the top guys like McMillan weren't necessarily open, it forced Fifita to try to make plays that necessarily wasn't there, and I think that's one of the big reasons why you saw such an uptake in Fifita's interceptions this year too. And also the offensive line did him no favors whatsoever too. When you're under distress and you're under pressure the entire time, really nothing kind of came together for this program. But overall, it's hard to feel optimistic about this program for a couple of different reasons. I mean, there's really no obvious transfers that are coming in where you say to yourself, okay, they're clearly replacing some of these guys here. You have to anticipate this is going to be a relatively young team. You say to yourself too, as long as you have this deficit on the books, you can't sit there and imagine that they're going to be too strong in terms of the NIL game, because where are they going to get their money from if they're on a deficit too? And granted, and especially for those who don't understand the financial aspects of it as much, it's actually quite common for programs to be running on a deficit. Like, for example, Stanford typically runs on the deficit. Oregon State does. So it's not necessarily that they're running on a deficit. It's that to this degree that they are running on a deficit to the point where you're going to have to seriously consider cutting different programs too. And especially in the day and age of Title IX, it's not as simple as saying, okay, we're just going to cut all the non-revenue sports, as they say, because you have to comply with that Title IX program in order to make sure you're a part of the NCAA. And also, when we're going to be in the shared revenue split of this day and age in college football, it's only going to add to those questions that have, quite frankly, have been there for quite a long time now. But you look at this team and you say to yourself, you lost Danny Gonzalez too, who's your special teams coordinator. Defensive coordinator is gone. I mean, Seth Doedge does have some quality experience at Marshall, Purdue, USC, just like I said too. He was a gunslinger when he was a quarterback under Mike Leach. I think that was about 2011, 2012, somewhere in there. So he's a real young guy, going to bring some enthusiasm to Tucson, Arizona. But you just kind of have to ask yourself, although the Big 12 is certainly one of the most competitive conferences in all of college football, in the sense of there is not necessarily a clear favorite every year like there perhaps you could argue in a Big 10 or the SEC or the ACC and whatnot too. But overall, it's hard to kind of see where this program's going, because you don't necessarily see a clear identity with this program. And even when you go back and you look at Brent Brennan's history as a head coach, and you look at who they're bringing in, and you see the results from last year, I think this is going to be a rebuild that is going to be a lot more difficult than what people are leading on. And especially when you have teams like Arizona State who are rising, you have other Big 12 teams who are coming. And I also think Utah and teams like Utah and Kansas State and Kansas are only going to get better this year compared to last year. So in terms of the Arizona team, watch for these struggles to sort of continue, and definitely be intrigued to kind of how Arizona tweaks their offense to make it more complementary towards Fifita, assuming that he's staying. And also, to what extent does Arizona still decide to double down on this air raid